Let's go geese. Honk, 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 honk. Let's go geese. Honk, 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 honk.
So goes each cheer. So goes the cheer each Saturday morning at 10 a.m. as our citywide kindergarten soccer matches kick off. Let's go geese. Honk, 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 honk. Thank you, Rowan, for that. Thank you for showing up with the dove this morning. Now, as both Becky and I don our coaches' t-shirts, Rowan, bless him, pray for him, as both of his parents are serving as coaches for him, takes on the honking of a fierce member of Team Geese. Now, all the kindergarten teams are avian inspired. Cardinals, owls, ravens, pigeons, and yes, shoebills. But though I'm super biased, there is something super special about Team Geese. Perhaps more aptly named Team Wild Geese. Have you ever tried to corral a beloved bunch of all-gendered, energetic kindergartners who have spent too much time cooped up, masked up, at home this past year? Let alone try to teach or guide or direct them into the ways of basic soccer skills. Holy chaos is often a term lifted from my lips after our weekly matches. Wild indeed, unpredictable, unscripted, hilarious, fun, spirited, holy. Holy Spirit. Yes, today we celebrate the wild in the holy. Happy Pentecost. Thank you for wearing red this morning. Y'all look wildly wonderful. We frequently refer to Spirit as dove, as we cue the response. Thank you, Tom and Tom. Sweet Holy Spirit, sweet heavenly dove. A rightly cherished image that harkens to the promise of land-based provision delivered by the olive branch-bearing dove who returns to Noah and Nayama on the ark. Of course, the Spirit descending to wet-headed Jesus as a dove to the divine soundtrack, "You are my beloved, in whom I am well pleased," is also deep in our hearts. But just as the many teams in Rowan City Soccer League remind us, there are other winged, spirited traditions. And a favorite one of mine lifted by those often unkempt, unruly ancient Celts who saw the Holy Spirit as the wild goose. They found evidence in this interpretation from the words of Jesus in John 3. The wind blows where it wills, and you can hear the sound it makes, but you do not know from where it comes or where it goes. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit. The honking, the unpredictability, the fierceness, like wild kindergartners joyously flocking after the ball, this spirit bird is a bit more untamed and perhaps a bit more exciting. And an image of God that I think our world needs this year in particular, more than ever, as the winds have been blowing so unpredictably. We feel hope as vaccine numbers continue to inch up here in our Commonwealth, yet we despair as COVID surge creeps into India's rural landscape. We are grateful for a ceasefire in the Holy Lands, but we rage against an ongoing occupation and denial of Palestinian sovereignty. And as we land this Tuesday on the year anniversary of George Floyd's murder, we are encouraged by a focus on police reform, while we are wearied by how much remains to tear down. Qualified immunity still remains at hold. We rejoice in blooming irises and the growing backyard vegetable gardens, yet we cringe at a warming Atlantic Ocean that has caused our hurricane season to once again start up before June 1st for a 7th year in a row. We give thanks for a federal government's focus on progress, even as we shudder at a party that wants to strip away voting and LGBTQ rights. And in our own community, as has been lifted, we rejoice at the births of baby Joseph and baby Eli, just as we lament at the death of a beloved Brian. There is so much that is shifting, so much unpredictable, so much unknown. And so it feels so fitting to to choose the wild goose this year as our image for Pentecost. Those wild, wide wings expanding. They feel quite apt for us, perhaps taking in the breadth, the unpredictability, and the span of these wild days. Today we celebrate that story from Luke's book of Acts about the Spirit's arrival in a suddenly wild, unpredictable wind and the landing of tongues of fire on people who then speak and understand each other's native tongues, and the birthday of the church. However, Pentecost is not a birthday of the Spirit, we remember. For she first shows up at the very beginning, about 16 words into the beginning of our Hebrew scriptures in Genesis, as Ruach Elohim, the Spirit of God, the breath of God, the wind of God that hovers over the waters of the deep, wildly sweeping over the depths, the holy as part of the creative chaos of Genesis, of beginning. In the Message, Eugene Peterson translates this as God's Spirit brooded like a bird over the watery abyss. That verb, hover or sweep or here brood, which offers a first glimpse of the Spirit's activity in the Bible, occurs elsewhere in the original Testament, including Deuteronomy, when God, as an eagle, stirs up its nests and over its young spreads its wings, takes them up and bears them aloft on its pinions. And this is tender yet powerful care, gripping the very neck of the people of God and setting them atop the heights of the land. The Spirit of God, at the birth of creation, hovering over the unknown, broods like a bird over that which is to come, that which is to be birthed. At the very beginning of our sacred stories, we meet a great Spirit hovering, undaunted at the forces that would oppose it. A Spirit as a wild advocate, brooding and waiting, and perhaps zoning in, especially on those places where there is wild division, violence, and chaos, unpredictability. On first glance, the birth of the church, as recorded in Acts, seems to paint a picture of the polar opposite of such division. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all gathered together in one place, community. Earlier in Acts, we read that there are about 120 people gathered together in that upper room, constantly devoting themselves to prayer, a spiritual community. And soon the sudden linguistically based common understanding, a radical spiritual community. But remember, the wild wind is also very present, and fear. Similar to the disciples of Jesus huddled in that upper room directly following the execution on the cross, these 120 also gathered in an upper room in fear. Would they too face the same political fate of their Nazarene rabbi? What would their movement without its leader look like? The road ahead, unknown. But in the face of their fears, they come together, all genders crossing social norms and expectations designed to keep people separated. They come together boldly to pray. And their courage and their constant prayers seemingly preconditions to the mysterious arrival of the Holy Spirit, showing up as fire, as wild goose. And that Spirit shows up not just to the original 120 followers of Jesus praying, but to a group of devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem. The Parthians, Medes, Elamites. Thank you, Kate, for reading this morning that long litany of what was then the known world, of course, forgetting large swaths of humanity scattered from Turtle Island to East Asia, to West Asia. These were not pilgrims that had traveled to the Holy City for the Feast of Weeks, as we sometimes think of them, but rather they were immigrant Jews living in Jerusalem. They were people who at one point emigrated from the north, south, east, west, all over the Roman Empire. And here is the miracle, that the Spirit shows up, and the 120 early Christian Galileans begin speaking with boldness about their experience of God's power in the immigrants' native languages. They don't speak in the language of empire, but in the languages of those subjected to empire. What does it mean? Skeptics thought they were drunk, filled with new wine. But on Pentecost, the good news comes not only to all people, all genders, all races, often to those often feeling excluded, but the Spirit most authentically is understood in the native tongue. The Spirit moves so that each of us can hear a message of God that God is powerful, that God is love at the very core of who we are, in our uniqueness, in our differences, with our particular quirks, idiosyncrasies. To those places, God's message of love lands. For the church here is born in the midst of these sacred differences. The unique languages of each matter. And we recognize that this language is not restricted to verbal or ASL communication, but to the way we express our true identity, the language of ourselves, that what deeply matters to us deeply matters to the Spirit. And all are understood better in this authentic expression of a radical spiritual community. We know the word Pentecost does not originate in Christianity, but was appropriated from Judaism. Pentecost coming from the Greek, meaning 50th day, the 50th day after Passover, celebrated as the Feast of Weeks, or Shavuot. And following this account from Acts, Christians reappropriated this Jewish holiday and reclaimed it as it falling 50 days after Easter. And you remember the Feast of Weeks commemorates not just the receiving of the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, but also an earth and harvest festival. The 50 days from Passover to this holiday are called the counting of Omer. This refers to how farmers would count each day after Pentecost, and on the 50th day would take their first fruits of their harvest and take a pilgrimage to the temple in Jerusalem to make a thanksgiving offering to God. I love this time of year, as many of us are finding the deep blessings of engaging soil and land, on raised beds or backyards or window flower boxes, the wonderful mystery of beauty brimming from new shoots, deepening roots, and edible life. My family has recently picked and savored the first fruits of basil, mint, cilantro, and dill. There's nothing like those first tastes, crisp, fresh, homegrown, miraculous. The notion of giving over these first miraculous tastes to God is a challenging one. There is a certain sacrifice here, a certain giving over. It requires a certain decentering of self or a recentering on God. And Pentecost reminds us of this selfless predisposition, which then seems to make space for the Holy Spirit showing up. There is a certain letting go. Now, last week, Reverend Joshua preached for us a profound sermon entitled, Let Go. And he pondered what it might look like for us to let go and release ourselves from the things that are holding us back from the fullness for which God desires for us. To let go and release ourselves from the past so that we can position ourselves to embrace the future and begin to imagine that little thing we call hope. And today's sermon title attempts to build off of this and adds that two-letter word, us. Let us go. This title implies motion, movement. Following the Spirit being church requires us to go, to organize for justice in active pursuit of love and peace. It also implies community. We go the road together. It also connotes liberation. We hear Moses and Miriam's refrain, let my people go. Let us go. The Spirit sets us forth into new landscapes and new freedoms. So friends, as we begin to re-emerge and move past COVID's intense grip in these days ahead, I wonder how we might go. I wonder what it looks like for us to give our first fruits to God in this new in-between into which we are emerging. How might we find freedom as we go along together? The visitation of the Holy Fire Goose that marks the birth of the church takes place to the backdrop of a harvest festival. The earth underlies it all. So as we begin to face perhaps our second birth, a post-pandemic worldview, I wonder if we would do well to remember the earth and to remember a calling to be organic, to be natural, to prioritize authenticity, to open up to our true selves, to let go of the falsehoods, the masks, the things that we tell ourselves, the lies we tell ourselves as we look in the mirror and we don't even know we're telling. To let go of the things that hold us back so that we can move together to move from competition to compassion, from capitalism to truth, to unfetter ourselves from the things that hold us back. As we hear Joel echoed in our text from Acts, I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh. Your children shall prophesy, your young ones shall see visions, your old ones dream dreams. The Spirit wants us, friends, to dream of a better world. Pentecost is people coming together and dreaming together, envisioning more justice, more hope, and working toward that end. Together and different. Remember, on this 50th day of resurrection, the Advocate transforms these ordinary sacred disciples into wise, strong, and courageous apostles who go out in power, in God's power, to change the world. As Reverend Barber preached at a Wild Goose Music, Arts, and Justice Festival 2 summers ago, the wonder of Pentecost is the power of people becoming united as vessels for God's power for peace and justice. In a somewhat desperate attempt to try and help our kindergartner geese to spread out and not clump up all in one mad frenzy wherever the ball goes, I introduced into our season a special play. We, of course, call it V formation. Make like geese, team, and spread out. And it works for defense and it works for offense. To my utter surprise, in our game yesterday, after I think the 50th time of me shouting out V formation, our geese began slowly to get it. And they began to slowly spread out. And in so doing, they found open space. They found newfound liberation. And after that, some selfless passing even emerged, and I'm not making this up, some more goals. V formation works. Friends of covenant, perhaps fellow kindergartners in the spiritual path, might we take note? Might we emerge from this past year following the sweet wild goose, and might we consider falling into a similar formation, our spiritual migration as a church and in our lives, as we begin to let us go in that new formation. Sibley's Bird Guide reminds us of how amazing geese are, especially the Canada geese around these parts, how incredibly common they are. You see them almost everywhere, but they are incredibly impressive, mostly vegan, these birds are. And their impressive migrations of up to a few thousand miles each year often bring them back to their original nesting grounds. And when they fly together with that signature formation, they can go about 70% further than if they flew alone. And who takes the lead? Of course, it's not one goose, it's every goose. They all take their turn. You know, being up front brings the most drag, the most drain. And so they need to share the burden of leadership as they move into the miracle of Newton's third law. And as they move behind the one in front, they're all lifted. They're all raised by the sacrifice of the one, that Christ-like sacrifice that we're all invited to share as we move together. So friends, I invite us into that idea. There's so many applications for it. To imagine ourselves as a church, to imagine yourself as a family, as an individual, as someone, as a part of a workplace team, to be a part of that formation, to spread out, find more liberation, speak up if you've always been the one way at the back of the line, move to the front, to share yourself a little bit more and see what God might birth into our midst. Friends, there is much before us as we move forward. May we meet the Spirit. May we be part of the Spirit as we are blessed into the wild unknown of what comes. Thanks be to God. Happy Pentecost.